In November 1998, construction workers breaking ground for a new shopping mall in Millfield, West Virginia, made a discovery that would forever change our understanding of corporate America's darkest chapter. Buried beneath 40 years of accumulated soil and debris, they uncovered dozens of corroded metal drums, each bearing the faded logo of Consolidated Chemical Corporation. The contents of those drums would reveal a conspiracy so systematic, so calculated, that it defies comprehension. What emerged from the subsequent investigation challenged everything we thought we knew about industrial safety, medical ethics, and the lengths corporations will go to protect their profits. Hidden in classified files for over 3 decades, sealed by court orders and corporate settlements, this is the story of 3 generations of families who became unwitting test subjects in one of America's most horrific human experiments. Before we dive into this disturbing case, make sure you're subscribed to Fear Classified. We uncover these forgotten horrors every week, bringing you the classified documents and sealed testimonies that powerful institutions hoped would never see the light of day. But this channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to learn what really happened when a trusted employer systematically poisoned an entire community in the name of scientific progress. The story begins in 1962 in a company town where families had worked for the same employer for generations, where trust was absolute and questioning authority was unthinkable, where Dr. Richard Stone, a brilliant chemist with an advanced degree from MIT, would orchestrate an experiment so monstrous that its effects continue to ripple through bloodlines today. This is the story of Millfield's children, born with birth defects that shouldn't exist, of parents who developed cancers at impossible rates, of grandchildren whose genetic code carries the scars of chemicals their grandparents never knew they were exposed to, and of the corporate machine that covered it up for 40 years. The truth is more horrifying than fiction. The victims were real, and somewhere in corporate boardrooms, executives knew exactly what they were doing. The year 1962 found America in the midst of an unprecedented chemical revolution. Post-war industrial expansion had transformed sleepy agricultural communities into bustling centers of manufacturing, and nowhere was this transformation more complete than in the Ohio River Valley. Here, along the winding waterway that separated West Virginia from Ohio, a constellation of chemical plants had emerged, each one promising prosperity to communities that had known only poverty. Millfield, West Virginia, population 3,847, had been built around coal mining for over a century. The town's narrow valley, carved between steep Appalachian ridges, had echoed with the sounds of mining, equipment, and the whistle of coal trains for generations. But by 1960, the mines were playing out, and the young men who might once have followed their fathers underground were looking elsewhere for work. Consolidated Chemical Corporation arrived in Millfield like a savior. The company, founded in 1923 and headquartered in Newark, Delaware, had grown from a small specialty chemical manufacturer into one of America's major industrial powerhouses. Their new West Virginia facility, announced with great fanfare in the spring of 1961, would employ over 800 people and produce advanced polymer compounds for the burgeoning plastics industry. The timing couldn't have been better. President Kennedy's new frontier was pushing American industry to new heights of innovation and productivity. The space race demanded new materials, new chemicals, new solutions to engineering problems that had never before been imagined. Environmental regulation was virtually non-existent. The Environmental Protection Agency wouldn't be established for another 8 years, and the Clean Air Act was still a pipe dream of environmental activists who barely registered on the national political radar. In this regulator, vacuum, chemical companies operated with breathtaking freedom. Safety standards were minimal, often nothing more than industry suggestions rather than government mandates. The prevailing wisdom held that progress required risk and that American workers were tough enough to handle whatever industry might throw at them. The concept of informed consent in workplace chemical exposure was not just ignored, it was actively dismissed as an impediment to innovation. At the center of this story stands Consolidated Chemical's new Millfield facility, a sprawling complex of gleaming steel tanks, towering distillation columns, and processing units that ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The plant specialized in the production of chlorinated organic compounds, chemicals that would later be recognized as some of the most persistent and dangerous pollutants ever created, but which in 1962 represented the cutting edge of industrial chemistry. Leading this operation was Dr. Richard Stone, a man whose credentials read like a who's who of American chemical education. Born in 1928 in Hartford, Connecticut, Stone had earned his undergraduate degree in chemistry from Yale University before completing his doctorate at MIT under the supervision of Dr. James Morrison, one of America's leading experts in organic synthesis. His doctoral thesis, Advanced Applications of Chlorinated Aromatic Compounds in Industrial Synthesis, would prove prophetic in ways that no one could have imagined. After completing his education, Stone had spent 5 years working for DuPont's Advanced Research Division before being recruited by Consolidated Chemical with an offer he couldn't refuse: complete autonomy over the Millfield facility's research and development operations, along with a salary that made him one of the highest paid men in West Virginia. What the company got in return was a brilliant scientist with few scruples and even fewer concerns about the ethical implications of his work. Stone arrived in Millfield in January 1962 with ambitious plans. The plant would not merely produce existing chemical compounds, it would serve as a testing ground for new formulations, new processes, and new applications for chemicals that existed nowhere else in the world. Corporate headquarters in Newark had made it clear that innovation was the priority, and that traditional safety concerns should not be allowed to impede scientific progress. The workforce that Stone inherited was typical of small-town industrial America in the early 1960s. These were men who had worked with their hands all their lives, who understood machinery and physical labor, but who had little formal education in chemistry or industrial safety. They trusted their employer implicitly, following instructions without question, and taking pride in being part of America's industrial might. What they didn't know was that they had just become test subjects in an experiment that would span 40 years and 3 generations of their families. The regulatory environment of 1962 made such experimentation not just possible but profitable. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration wouldn't be established until 1970, and existing workplace safety regulations were so limited as to be almost meaningless. Chemical companies were essentially free to expose their workers to any substance they chose, provided they didn't cause immediate and obvious harm. More importantly, there was no requirement to inform workers about potential health risks. The concept of a material safety data sheet, the basic document that today informs workers about chemical hazards, wouldn't become standard practice for another 2 decades. Workers at the Millfield Palais not received no information about the chemicals they handled beyond basic operational instructions. They were told what to do, but never what they were working with or why they should be careful. This information gap was not accidental. Internal corporate documents that would later surface during litigation reveal that Consolidated Chemical had conducted extensive laboratory studies on many of the compounds being produced at Millfield. They knew these chemicals were dangerous. They knew they caused cancer in laboratory animals. They knew they could cause birth defects and genetic damage. But they also knew that no law required them to share this information with their workers. The company-town dynamics of Millfield made the situation even more insidious. Consolidated Chemical wasn't just the largest employer in town, it was virtually the only employer. The company sponsored the local Little League teams, funded the new high school gymnasium, and provided the primary source of tax revenue that kept the town running. Questioning the company's practices wasn't just professionally dangerous, it was an attack on the entire community's economic foundation. This economic stranglehold extended to the town's medical facilities. Dr. Margaret Whitmore, Millfield's only physician, had her medical practice housed in a building owned by Consolidated Chemical. The town's small hospital received regular donations from the company, and several of its board members were plant executives. When workers began experiencing unusual health problems, the medical establishment that should have protected them was compromised from the very beginning. Local government was equally compromised. Mayor Robert Hutchinson had worked at the plant for 15 years before being elected to office. The town council included 3 current plant employees and 2 retirees who received company pensions. The police chief's son worked in the plant's maintenance department. These weren't conflicts of interest. They were the natural result of a community where one employer dominated every aspect of life. Into this environment, Dr. Richard Stone would introduce chemicals that had never been tested on human beings, using exposure methods that would have been considered criminal if anyone had known they were happening. But in the regulatory vacuum of 1962, with a compliant workforce and a compromised local power structure, Stone had the perfect laboratory for testing the limits of human chemical tolerance. The stage was set for one of the most systematic and prolonged cases of human experimentation in American industrial history. What happened next would affect not just the workers who walked through the plant gates each morning, but their children and their children's children in ways that science was only beginning to understand. The Consolidated Chemical Corporation facility in Millfield represented more than just another industrial plant. It was a carefully designed laboratory for human experimentation masquerading as a legitimate manufacturing operation. Declassified corporate documents reveal that the facility's primary purpose was not production efficiency, but rather the systematic testing of chemical compounds on human subjects without their knowledge or consent. Dr. Richard Stone's personal papers, obtained through a court order in 1999, provide a chilling window into the mind of a man who viewed his workforce not as employees, but as research subjects. His private journal, maintained meticulously throughout his tenure at Millfield, reads like the notes of a detached observer studying laboratory animals rather than the thoughts of a manager responsible for human welfare. Stone's background made him uniquely qualified for this monstrous undertaking. His graduate research at MIT had focused on the physiological effects of chlorinated organic compounds, work that had been funded by a consortium of chemical companies seeking to understand the safety profiles of their products. But where ethical researchers would have limited their studies to cell cultures and laboratory animals, Stone had always been frustrated by what he termed the gap between laboratory theory and real-world application. In a letter to his former MIT advisor dated March 15, 1962, Stone wrote about his excitement at finally having access to a human population suitable for extended exposure studies. The letter, discovered decades later in archived university correspondence, reveals Stone's belief that traditional safety research was hopelessly constrained by artificial ethical limitations that bear no relation to industrial reality. The physical design of the Millfield plant reflected Stone's experimental agenda. Unlike typical chemical manufacturing facilities where workers would be rotated between different areas to minimize exposure to any single compound, the Millfield plant was organized into distinct zones, each focused on a specific class of chemicals. Workers were assigned to these zones permanently, creating stable test populations for long-term exposure studies. Zone A, located in the plant's eastern wing, specialized in chlorinated benzene compounds, chemicals that Stone's research had identified as particularly effective at crossing the blood-brain barrier. Workers in this area were exposed to airborne concentrations that internal company documents show exceeded Stone's own safety recommendations by factors of 10 to 20. Yet no special protective equipment was provided, and workers were actively discouraged from wearing even basic respiratory protection. According to plant safety records that surfaced during litigation, workers who complained about the strong chemical odors in Zone A were told that the smell was harmless and that wearing masks would interfere with their ability to detect dangerous gas leaks. This deliberate misinformation served Stone's research purposes perfectly. He needed consistent, measurable exposure levels, and protective equipment would have compromised his data collection. Zone B focused on organophosphate compounds, chemicals originally developed as nerve agents during World War II, but later adapted for industrial use. Stone's research notes indicate that he was particularly interested in studying the long-term neurological effects of chronic low-level exposure to these substances. Workers in Zone B reported frequent headaches, dizziness, and difficulty concentrating, symptoms that Stone meticulously documented in quarterly medical examinations that workers believed were standard occupational health screenings. The most disturbing revelation in Stone's papers concerns Zone C, where experimental compounds that existed nowhere else in the world were being tested. These were chemicals that Stone had synthesized in small batches, combining known toxic substances in new configurations to study their synergistic effects. Internal memos reveal that corporate headquarters in Newark had given Stone complete freedom to experiment with these compounds, provided that he could demonstrate their potential commercial applications. Workers in Zone C were essentially guinea pigs for chemical compounds that had never been tested on any living organism. They handled these substances daily, often with minimal protection, while Stone observed and documented their physiological responses. Medical records show that Zone C workers experienced the highest rates of illness, with symptoms ranging from severe respiratory problems to neurological disorders that doctors couldn't identify or treat. Stone's methodology was as systematic as it was ruthless. Each worker underwent monthly medical examinations that were far more comprehensive than typical occupational health screenings. Blood samples were collected and shipped to a private laboratory in Baltimore for analysis. Urine samples were tested for chemical metabolites that would indicate absorption levels. Even hair and fingernail samples were collected and analyzed, creating a detailed biochemical profile of each worker's exposure. The workers were told that these examinations were evidence of Consolidated Chemical's commitment to their health and safety. In reality, they were being monitored like laboratory animals to track the progression of chemical poisoning. Stone's notes reveal his frustration when workers missed their scheduled examinations, not because he was concerned for their welfare, but because it disrupted his Data C election. Perhaps most chilling of all, Stone extended his research beyond the plant workers themselves. Company records show that he established a program of free medical screenings for workers' families, ostensibly as a company benefit. These screenings focused heavily on reproductive health and child development, areas where Stone suspected that chemical exposures might have generational effects. Pregnant wives of plant workers were encouraged to participate in special prenatal monitoring programs. Their children received extensive developmental assessments that continued throughout their school years. Stone was particularly interested in documenting birth defects, learning disabilities, and other developmental abnormalities that might be linked to their father's chemical exposures. The scope of Stone's human experimentation became clear only decades later, when litigation forced the disclosure of his research files. Between 1962 and 1975, he had systematically exposed over 800 workers and their families to experimental chemical compounds while documenting the health effects with scientific precision. His research produced over 40 scientific papers published in prestigious chemistry and toxicology journals that established him as a leading expert on human chemical tolerance. What those papers never mentioned was that the industrial exposure data they contained had been obtained without the knowledge or consent of the human subjects involved. The scientific community that celebrated Stone's groundbreaking research never knew that it was built on a foundation of systematic human rights violations. Stone's corporate superiors were not merely complicit in his research, they were active collaborators. Quarterly reports submitted to Consolidated Chemical's board of directors detailed the progress of various human factors research projects, with the same clinical detachment that might be used to discuss equipment maintenance or production efficiency. These reports, discovered during discovery proceedings in the 1990s, reveal a corporate culture where human welfare was subordinated to research, objectives, and profit margins. A particularly damning memo from Consolidated Chemical's research director, dated September 1965, commended Stone for his innovative approach to human exposure research and authorized additional funding for expanding the study population. The memo specifically noted that Stone's work was providing invaluable data that could not be obtained through conventional research methods, a euphemistic reference to the fact that no ethical review board would ever have approved such experiments. The regulatory environment of the 1960s made Stone's work possible, but it was corporate policy that made it inevitable. Internal documents reveal that Consolidated Chemical had made a strategic decision to use its smaller facilities like Millfield as testing grounds for experimental compounds that were too dangerous to produce at their larger, more visible plants. The company calculated that the remote location and economic dependence of communities like Millfield would minimize the risk of unwanted attention or regulatory intervention. This calculation proved accurate for over 3 decades. Stone's experiments continued unabated until his retirement in 1989, expanding to encompass not just chemical exposure studies, but also research into the effectiveness of various medical countermeasures and the long-term health effects of chronic poisoning. By the time his work was finally exposed, 3 generations of Millfield families had been systematically poisoned in the name of scientific progress. The man himself remains an enigma even today. After retiring from Consolidated Chemical, Stone moved to a small coastal town in Maine, where he lived quietly until his death in 2003. Attempts to interview him during the litigation were unsuccessful. He invoked his Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination and refused to discuss his work at Millfield. His personal papers suggest a man who genuinely believed that his research served the greater good, even as it destroyed the lives of hundreds of innocent people. In one of his final journal entries, dated just months before his death, Stone wrote, "History will vindicate the work we did at Millfield. The knowledge we gained about human chemical tolerance has saved countless lives and advanced the cause of industrial safety immeasurably. That some individuals suffered in the process is regrettable, but such sacrifices are the price of scientific progress." It was a cold epitaph for a man whose work had poisoned 3 generations and whose legacy continues to claim victims today. The systematic poisoning of Millfield's workers and their families was not a matter of neglect or accidental exposure. It was a carefully orchestrated program of human experimentation that operated with scientific precision for over 4 decades. Declassified corporate documents and internal research files reveal the disturbing methodology behind what may be the most extensive case of workplace chemical warfare in American history. Dr. Stone's experimental protocol divided the workforce into carefully controlled exposure groups, each designed to test specific hypotheses about human chemical tolerance. Plant personnel records show that worker assignments were not based on experience or aptitude, but rather on demographic characteristics that Stone believed would yield the most scientifically valuable data. Young men in their 20s were preferentially assigned to areas with the highest chemical concentrations, allowing Stone to study the effects of peak exposure periods on developing adults. Middle-aged workers with families were placed in zones where they would be exposed to compounds known to affect reproductive health, enabling research into generational transmission of chemical effects. Older workers near retirement were assigned to areas with chemicals suspected of accelerating aging processes, providing data on late-life toxicity effects. The exposure methodology was insidiously sophisticated. Rather than simply allowing workers to encounter chemicals through normal industrial processes, Stone designed specific exposure scenarios that maximized absorption while minimizing the risk of acute poisoning that might attract unwanted attention. Workers were required to perform tasks that brought them into direct physical contact with chemical compounds, often without protective equipment that was readily available but deliberately withheld. Interiors. Nile memos reveal that Stone had calculated optimal exposure levels for each compound based on animal studies conducted at private laboratories. These calculations determined not just the concentration of chemicals in workplace air, but also the frequency and duration of direct skin contact that workers would experience. The goal was to achieve maximum chemical absorption while staying just below the threshold that would cause immediately recognizable symptoms. Zone A workers, who handled chlorinated benzene compounds, were required to manually inspect and clean processing equipment that was deliberately designed to leak small amounts of chemicals during operation. Workers were told that these minor leaks were normal and unavoidable, when in fact they were precisely engineered to ensure consistent dermal exposure. Safety protocols required workers to use their bare hands for these inspections, despite the availability of chemical-resistant gloves that remained locked in storage rooms. The organophosphate compounds in Zone B presented different challenges for Stone's research. These chemicals were too obviously dangerous to handle without some protective equipment, so Stone developed a protocol of deliberately defective safety gear. Respiratory masks were provided, but with filters that had been modified to allow specific percentages of chemical vapors to pass through. Workers believed they were protected while actually receiving carefully calibrated doses of nerve agents. Medical records obtained through litigation reveal that Zone B workers experienced a characteristic progression of neurological symptoms that perfectly matched Stone's research predictions. Initial symptoms included mild headaches and concentration difficulties that workers attributed to job stress. These progressed to memory problems, mood changes, and motor skill deterioration. They had developed so gradually that most workers adapted to them as normal aspects of aging. Zone C, where Stone's experimental compounds were tested, operated under even more extreme conditions. Workers in this area were exposed to chemicals that had never been tested on any living organism, making them literal test subjects for substances that existed nowhere else on Earth. Stone's research notes describe his excitement at having access to chemically naive human populations who could provide baseline data on completely novel compounds. The experimental compounds in Zone C were designed to test specific biological pathways and mechanisms of toxicity. Some were engineered to cross the blood-brain barrier more efficiently than existing chemicals. Others were designed to accumulate in fatty tissues, providing data on long-term storage and release patterns in human bodies. Still others were formulated to interfere with specific enzymatic processes, allowing Stone to study the human body's adaptive responses to chemical stress. Workers in Zone C experienced the most severe and bizarre symptoms. Medical records document cases of sudden hair loss, unexplained weight fluctuations, severe skin conditions that didn't respond to treatment, and neurological problems that baffled local physicians. Dr. Whitmore's medical notes express her frustration at being unable to diagnose or treat conditions she had never encountered in medical literature. The most diabolical aspect of Stone's methodology was his use of control groups within the exposed population. Not all workers received the same chemical exposures. Some were deliberately given lower doses or different compounds to serve as comparison subjects. These workers often experienced milder symptoms, which Stone used to argue that the more severe cases were due to individual sensitivity rather than excessive exposure levels. Stone's research extended far beyond the plant floor through his family screening programs. These programs were presented to the community as evidence of Consolidated Chemical's commitment to worker welfare, but internal documents reveal their true purpose: to study the generational transmission of chemical effects and to identify genetic factors that might influence toxicity responses. Pregnant workers' wives were enrolled in prenatal monitoring programs that tracked fetal development with unprecedented detail. Ultrasound examinations, blood tests, and other assessments were conducted monthly throughout pregnancy, generating data on how workplace chemical exposures affected fetal growth and development. Women were told that this intensive monitoring was designed to ensure healthy pregnancies, when in fact it was documenting chemical-induced developmental abnormalities. Children born to plant workers received lifelong monitoring through programs disguised as educational and health services. School performance was tracked meticulously, with particular attention to learning, disabilities, and behavioral problems. Annual physical examinations documented growth patterns, neurological development, and the emergence of chronic health conditions. Even routine childhood illnesses were analyzed for patterns that might indicate chemical-related immune system dysfunction. The data collection was remarkably comprehensive. Stone maintained detailed files on over 2,000 individuals, workers, spouses, and children, spanning multiple decades. These files contained medical histories, exposure records, family genetic information, and detailed behavioral observations that were collected through surveillance that the subjects never knew was occurring. Local businesses were recruited to participate in this surveillance network. The company doctor who conducted workers' annual physicals also treated their families, providing Stone with complete medical histories for entire family units. The local pharmacist reported prescription patterns that might indicate chemical-related health problems. Stone's methodology was refined continuously based on emerging research and changing regulatory environments. When workplace air quality standards were introduced in the early 1970s, Stone developed new exposure methods that technically complied with regulations while maintaining his experimental protocols. Chemicals were reformulated to exist just below detection thresholds of standard monitoring equipment. Exposure was shifted from inhalation to dermal contact, which was not covered by existing regulations. The introduction of material safety datasheets in the 1980s presented a more serious challenge to Stone's work. Rather than providing accurate safety information, Consolidated Chemical produced deliberately misleading datasheets that understated the toxicity of their experimental compounds. Workers who requested safety information received documents that described their workplace chemicals as minimally hazardous or safe when used as directed, when internal research had documented severe toxicity at exposure levels routinely encountered in the plant. Perhaps most disturbing of all was Stone's research into medical countermeasures and treatments. Rather than seeking to prevent chemical poisoning, he was systematically studying how much damage the human body could sustain while remaining functional. His research notes include detailed observations on the progression of organ damage, the development of chemical tolerance, and the effectiveness of various treatments in maintaining worker productivity despite ongoing poisoning. Medical interventions provided to plant workers were themselves experimental. Workers who developed obvious symptoms were treated with experimental therapies that were as much research tools as medical treatments. Stone used these treatment protocols to study the reversibility of chemical damage and to identify biomarkers that could predict long-term health effects. The scope and sophistication of Stone's methodology becomes clear only when viewed in its entirety. This was not a case of industrial negligence or corner-cutting to save money. It was a systematic program of human experimentation that operated with the same scientific rigor that might be applied to laboratory animal studies. The difference was that the subjects were human beings who never knew they were participating in research that would poison them and their children for generations to come. By the time Stone's experiments were finally exposed, they had affected over 3,000 individuals directly and thousands more through family connections and community contamination. The methodology he developed became a template for similar programs at other Consolidated Chemical facilities, spreading his human experimentation protocols throughout the company's operations. The true horror of Stone's work lies not just in its systematic nature, but in its calculated coldness. These were not the desperate actions of a rogue scientist, but the methodical implementation of a research program that had been approved, funded, and supported by corporate management for over 4 decades. Every exposure was measured, every symptom documented, every victim treated as a data point in a vast experiment that treated human life as expendable in the pursuit of scientific knowledge and corporate profit. The human cost of Dr. Stone's experiments cannot be measured in statistics alone, though the numbers are staggering. By 1998, when litigation finally forced the disclosure of medical records, over 800 original plant workers had been systematically poisoned, along with their spouses and children. But the true scope of the tragedy only becomes clear when examining the individual stories of families whose genetic legacy was forever altered by chemicals they never knew they were being exposed to. The first generation of victims, the workers themselves, experienced a nightmare of progressive illness that they could never understand or explain. Medical records reveal patterns of disease that defied conventional diagnosis, symptoms that appeared and disappeared without apparent cause, and chronic conditions that no local physician had ever encountered. James Mitchell, hired as a maintenance worker in Zone A in March 1962, represents the typical experience of first-generation victims. Plant personnel records show that Mitchell was 24 years old when he began work, newly married, and in excellent physical health. His pre-employment medical examination documented no significant health problems, normal blood chemistry, and physical condition consistent with his background in manual labor. Within 18 months of beginning work at the plant, Mitchell's quarterly medical examinations began, documenting subtle but consistent changes in his health status. His white blood cell count dropped steadily, falling to levels that would normally indicate immune system compromise. His liver enzymes showed gradual elevation, suggesting ongoing toxic exposure. Most ominously, his neurological examinations revealed progressive deterioration in memory, coordination, and cognitive function. Dr. Whitmore's medical notes express her growing concern about Mitchell's condition, but also her frustration at being unable to identify any underlying cause. The symptoms were consistent with chemical poisoning, but Mitchell's work assignments, as described by plant management, involved no known toxic substances. When Mitchell complained of persistent headaches, chronic fatigue, and difficulty concentrating, he was referred to specialists in Charleston who were equally baffled by his constellation of symptoms. The progression of Mitchell's illness followed a pattern that would later be recognized as characteristic of chronic organochlorine poisoning. Initial symptoms were subtle enough to be attributed to stress or normal aging. Neurological effects developed gradually, often mistaken for depression or psychological problems. Physical symptoms like skin rashes, respiratory problems, and digestive issues appeared intermittently, making them difficult to connect to workplace exposures. Mitchell's medical records document a particularly disturbing aspect of Stone's experimental protocol, the deliberate provision of ineffective treatments designed to study the progression of chemical poisoning. When Mitchell developed severe dermatitis from handling chlorinated compounds, he was treated with topical medications that Stone's research had shown to be ineffective for chemical-induced skin conditions. The purpose was not to heal Mitchell, but to document the natural progression of his illness, without effective intervention. By 1975, 13 years after beginning work at the plant, Mitchell's health had deteriorated dramatically. He suffered from chronic liver disease, neurological impairment severe enough to affect his ability to work, and a rare form of skin cancer that his physicians had never encountered. He was forced to leave his job on medical disability, believing his illness was due to an unlucky combination of genetic factors and environmental exposures that no one could have predicted. Mitchell died in 1987 at the age of 49, his death certificate listing liver failure as the primary cause. An autopsy performed as part of the later litigation revealed chemical residues in his tissues at concentrations that experts described as incompatible with accidental exposure. The chemicals found in Mitchell's body included experimental compounds that existed nowhere else in the world except in Stone's Zone A laboratory. The second generation of victims, the children of plant workers, experienced health problems that were even more disturbing because they appeared from birth. These children were born with genetic damage caused by their parents' chemical exposures, creating patterns of birth defects and developmental abnormalities that local physicians could not explain. Sarah Mitchell, James Mitchell's daughter, was born in 1964 with multiple congenital abnormalities that would define her entire life. Medical records from her birth describe a complex array of physical and neurological defects, including spina bifida, cleft palate, and severe cognitive impairment. Her pediatrician's notes express puzzlement at the unusual combination of birth defects, which didn't fit any recognized syndrome or genetic pattern. Stone's research files, discovered decades later, reveal that Sarah Mitchell's birth defects were not unexpected complications, but predicted outcomes of his experimental protocol. His research had identified specific chemicals that could cause these exact abnormalities when parents were exposed during critical periods before conception. Sarah's birth provided valuable data on the generational transmission of chemical effects, data that Stone meticulously documented while providing no information to her parents about the cause of her condition. The children of Zone B workers exposed to organophosphate compounds experienced different but equally devastating effects. These children appeared physically normal at birth, but developed severe learning disabilities and behavioral problems as they aged. School records from the 1970s and 1980s document extraordinary rates of attention deficit disorders, autism spectrum conditions, and cognitive impairments among children whose parents worked in Zone B. Michael Patterson, son of Zone B worker Robert Patterson, exemplifies the second-generation neurological damage. Born in 1967, Michael appeared healthy as an infant, but began showing signs of developmental delay by his second birthday. He was late to speak, struggled with basic motor skills, and exhibited behavioral problems that worsened throughout his childhood. School psychological evaluations documented Michael's profound learning disabilities, but could offer no explanation for their cause. He required special education services throughout his school years, never progressing beyond a third-grade reading level despite intensive intervention. As an adult, Michael has been unable to live independently, requiring supervised care that his family has struggled to provide. Dr. Stone's research notes reveal that Michael's condition was a direct result of his father's exposure to experimental organophosphate compounds. The chemicals had damaged Robert Patterson's sperm production, creating genetic defects that were passed to his son. Stone's research had predicted this outcome and documented Michael's development as part of his study on generational transmission of neurological damage. The third generation of victims, the grandchildren of original plant workers, represents perhaps the most tragic aspect of the Millfield conspiracy. These children, born in the 1980s and 1990s, inherited genetic damage that had been passed down through their family lines, creating health problems too. Continue to emerge today. Jennifer Patterson Williams, Michael Patterson's daughter, was born in 1991 with severe immunodeficiency disorders that have required lifelong medical intervention. Her immune system, compromised by genetic damage inherited through her father's family line, cannot protect her from routine infections that healthy children easily overcome. She has required multiple hospitalizations, experimental treatments, and constant medical monitoring throughout her childhood and into adulthood. Medical geneticists who examined Jennifer during the litigation identified specific chromosomal markers that directly link her immune system problems to the organophosphate exposures her grandfather experienced in Zone B. The genetic damage was so precise and unusual that it could only have resulted from exposure to the experimental compounds that Stone had tested on Robert Patterson decades before Jennifer's birth. The families affected by Stone's experiments share common patterns of suffering that extend far beyond individual health problems. The financial burden of caring for chemically damaged family members has driven many families into bankruptcy. Medical insurance often refuses to cover treatments for conditions that physicians cannot properly diagnose or understand. The social isolation experienced by families dealing with unexplained illnesses has torn apart the close-knit community that once characterized Millfield. The psychological trauma experienced by the victims and their families represents another dimension of suffering that Stone's research never addressed. Learning that their illnesses were not accidents of fate, but the result of deliberate poisoning has devastated many families. The knowledge that their genetic lines may be damaged for generations has created profound depression and anxiety among survivors who fear what their children and grandchildren might face. Support groups formed by affected families reveal the depth of anger and betrayal felt by victims who trusted their employer to keep them safe. Many workers describe feeling used and thrown away by a company that profited from their suffering. The discovery that their illnesses provided valuable research data adds another layer of violation to their experience of betrayal. Medical records document over 200 cases of cancers among first-generation plant workers, including rare forms of the disease that occur in the general population at rates of less than 1 in a million. Neurological diseases affected over 300 workers, with conditions ranging from Parkinson's disease to forms of dementia that have no known causes. Liver disease, kidney failure, and respiratory conditions claimed the lives of workers at rates far exceeding any comparable population. Among second-generation victims, birth defects occurred at rates nearly 50 times higher than national averages. Learning disabilities affected over 60% of children born to plant workers between 1962 and 1985. Developmental delays, behavioral problems, and chronic health conditions created a generation of children who required lifelong care and support that their families could barely provide. The third generation faces an uncertain future as genetic damage continues to manifest in unpredictable ways. Children born with apparently normal health are developing unusual cancers in their teens and 20s. Fertility problems affect young adults at extraordinary rates, with many unable to conceive children of their own. Those who do become parents face the terrifying possibility that they may pass damaged genes to another generation. The human cost of Stone's experiments extends beyond the individuals who were directly affected. The entire community of Millfield bears the scars of systematic poisoning that destroyed the trust and social fabric that had held the town together for generations. Families that had worked side by side for decades were torn apart by illness. The conspiracy that poisoned 3 generations of Millfield families might never have been exposed if not for the courage of a single individual who risked everything to bring the truth to light. The discovery of Stone's experiments began not with government investigation or media scrutiny, but with the moral awakening of someone who had been complicit in the cover-up for over 2 decades. Dr. Elizabeth Harper joined Consolidated Chemical's corporate medical department in 1974, fresh from completing her residency in occupational medicine at Johns Hopkins University. Her initial assignment was routine, conducting periodic reviews of employee health records to ensure compliance with emerging workplace safety regulations. What she discovered in those records would haunt her for the rest of her career and ultimately lead to the exposure of one of America's most extensive corporate crimes. Harper's first indication that something was wrong came during a routine statistical analysis of worker health data in early 1975. Federal regulations required chemical companies to track certain types of occupational illnesses and report unusual patterns to government authorities. As Harper compiled the required reports for Millfield and other consolidated chemical facilities, she noticed anomalies in the Millfield data that made no statistical sense. The rates of cancer, neurological disease, and birth defects among Millfield workers and their families were so far outside normal ranges that Harper initially assumed the data contained errors. Workers at the small West Virginia plant were experiencing illness rates that exceeded those at much larger facilities, handling far more dangerous chemicals. Even more puzzling, the types of diseases documented at Millfield included rare conditions that Harper had never encountered in occupational medicine. Harper's initial inquiries to Dr. Stone about the unusual health patterns were met with explanations that seemed plausible but left her with nagging doubts. Stone attributed the high disease rates to genetic factors specific to the Appalachian population, environmental contamination from decades of coal mining, and the advanced age profile of the workforce. He provided Harper with detailed reports supporting these explanations, complete with statistical analyses and literature references that appeared to substantiate his claims. For several months, Harper accepted Stone's explanations and dutifully filed reports that downplayed the significance of Millfield's health problems. But her medical training had taught her to question data that didn't fit expected patterns, and the Millfield numbers continued to trouble her. The diseases affecting workers were too specific, too unusual, and too concentrated to be explained by the environmental factors Stone had identified. The breakthrough came in late 1975, when Harper was conducting a routine audit of medical supply purchases across Consolidated Chemicals facilities. The audit revealed that the Millfield plant was ordering enormous quantities of specialized blood testing supplies, neurological assessment equipment, and other medical materials that had no apparent connection to routine occupational health programs. Even more suspicious, many of these supplies were being shipped not to the plant's medical facility, but to private laboratories that Harper had never heard of. When Harper questioned the medical supply purchases, she was told that Millfield was participating in an advanced research program designed to develop new approaches to occupational health monitoring. The explanation seemed reasonable, but Harper's attempts to obtain more information about the research program were consistently frustrated. Her requests for documentation were denied, her questions were deflected, and her supervisors made it clear that further inquiries would not be welcome. The corporate resistance to her questions convinced Harper that something significant was being concealed. Using her access to corporate medical records, she began conducting her own investigation into the Millfield situation. What she discovered in those records would shatter her faith in the company she worked for and ultimately lead to her decision to risk everything to expose the truth. Harper's investigation revealed that the Millfield medical monitoring program was far more extensive than anything she had encountered at other facilities. Workers were undergoing monthly blood tests, quarterly neurological examinations, and annual comprehensive medical assessments that generated massive amounts of data. Even more disturbing, these examinations were focusing on biomarkers and physiological indicators that were typically associated with toxic chemical exposure rather than routine occupational health screening. The medical records also revealed that workers' families were being subjected to similar monitoring through programs that were disguised as community health initiatives. Children of plant workers were receiving developmental assessments that tracked cognitive function, behavioral patterns, and physical development with scientific precision. Pregnant wives of workers were enrolled in prenatal monitoring, programs that documented fetal development in extraordinary detail. Most damning of all, Harper discovered that the medical data from Millfield was being compiled into research reports that were being submitted to scientific journals for publication. These reports, authored by Dr. Stone and other corporate researchers, described groundbreaking research into human chemical tolerance and occupational health effects. The papers never mentioned that the research subjects were unaware they were participating in experiments or that they had never provided informed consent for the studies. Harper's medical training allowed her to understand the implications of Stone's research in ways that corporate executives could not. The chemicals being studied at Millfield included compounds that were known to cause genetic damage, neurological deterioration, and developmental abnormalities. The exposure levels documented in the research papers were far above anything that could be considered safe, even by the minimal standards of the 1970s. The realization that her employer was systematically poisoning its own workers created a moral crisis for Harper that dominated her life for the next 2 decades. She understood that exposing the Millfield experiments would end her career and likely result in legal retaliation from one of America's most powerful corporations, but she also understood that remaining silent would make her complicit in ongoing crimes against hundreds of innocent people. Harper's first attempt to address the situation through internal channels was met with hostility and threats. When she presented her findings to her immediate supervisor in 1976, she was told that her concerns were unfounded and that further investigation would be considered insubordination. When she persisted, she was reassigned to a different department and warned that continued troublemaking would result in termination. The corporate response convinced Harper that the Millfield experiments were not the work of a rogue scientist, but were being conducted with the full knowledge and approval of senior management. Her access to corporate medical records was restricted, her security clearance was reduced, and she was excluded from meetings and decisions that had previously been part of her responsibilities. For nearly 20 years, Harper struggled with the knowledge of what was happening at Millfield while being powerless to stop it. She documented everything she could, maintaining secret files of medical data, internal memos, and research reports that she hoped might someday be used to expose the conspiracy. She watched as Stone's experiments continued and expanded, affecting more workers and their families while generating research data that advanced his scientific reputation. The turning point came in 1994, when Harper learned that her own daughter had developed a rare form of childhood leukemia that was being treated at the same research hospital where Stone's chemical exposure studies were being conducted. The coincidence was almost certainly random, but it crystallized Harper's understanding of how it would feel to be an unknowing victim of medical experimentation. The thought that other parents were watching their children suffer while remaining ignorant of the true cause of their illnesses became more than she could bear. Harper's decision to become a whistleblower was not made lightly. She understood that challenging Consolidated Chemical would require legal expertise and financial resources that were far beyond her means. She also understood that the company would use every tool at its disposal to discredit her testimony and destroy her reputation. The personal risks were enormous, but the moral imperative to protect the victims of ongoing experimentation was stronger. Her first step was to secretly copy thousands of pages of corporate medical records, research reports, and internal communications that documented the scope of Stone's experiments. This process took over 2 years, as Harper had to be extremely careful to avoid detection while systematically photographing documents during evenings and weekends when the corporate offices were empty. The evidence Harper compiled painted a picture of systematic human experimentation that was breathtaking in its scope and callousness. Internal memos revealed that corporate executives had known about the dangerous nature of Stone's work from its inception and had actively supported its continuation. Research budgets showed that millions of dollars had been spent on experimental programs that had no purpose other than studying the effects of chemical poisoning on human subjects. Most important of all, Harper's evidence included medical data that directly linked specific chemical exposures to the diseases and birth defects that were devastating Millfield families. The connection between cause and effect was documented with scientific precision in Stone's own research files, providing irrefutable proof that the health problems were not accidental but were the intended outcomes of deliberate experimentation. Finding attorneys willing to take on Consolidated Chemical proved to be another major challenge. Most lawyers were intimidated by the company's legal resources and reluctant to challenge a corporation with a reputation for destroying anyone who opposed it. Harper contacted over 30 law firms before finding a team of attorneys who specialized in corporate whistleblower cases and had the experience and resources needed to take on such a powerful adversary. The legal team that ultimately agreed to represent Harper and the Millfield victims included David Richardson, a former federal prosecutor with experience in corporate crime cases, and Sarah Martinez, a specialist in toxic tort litigation who had previously won major settlements against chemical companies. Their decision to take the case was motivated not just by the strength of Harper's evidence, but by their recognition that the Millfield situation represented one of the most egregious examples of corporate malfeasance they had ever encountered. The decision to file suit against Consolidated Chemical was complicated by the fact that many of the victims were unaware that their illnesses had been deliberately caused. The lawyers faced the delicate task of informing families that their suffering was not the result of bad luck or genetic factors, but was the intended outcome of systematic poisoning. Many families initially refused to believe that their trusted employer could have deliberately harmed them and their children. Harper's role as the primary whistleblower required her to testify about her knowledge of the conspiracy while facing intense scrutiny from Consolidated Chemical's legal team. The company's attorneys attempted to discredit her testimony by portraying her as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge against her former employer. They questioned her mental stability, her professional competence, and her motives for maintaining secret files of corporate documents. The pressure on Harper during the litigation was enormous. She received threatening phone calls, her home was burglarized, and her personal finances were subjected to intensive investigation by private detectives hired by the company. Corporate attorneys filed motions challenging her right to possess the documents she had copied, arguing that she had stolen proprietary information and violated her employment agreements. Despite the personal cost, Harper's testimony provided the foundation for exposing the full scope of Stone's experiments. Her detailed knowledge of corporate medical programs, her access to internal documents, and her ability to explain the scientific significance of the evidence made her an invaluable witness for the victims. Without her courage and expertise, the Millfield conspiracy might never have been exposed. The vindication of Harper's decision to speak out came when additional whistleblowers began coming forward, encouraged by her example. Plant workers who had suspected that their illnesses were work-related finally had a forum to tell their stories. Former company employees provided additional documentation of the conspiracy. Even some of Stone's research collaborators eventually testified about their knowledge of the human experimentation programs. Harper's whistleblowing ultimately led to one of the largest corporate settlements in American legal history, but the personal cost to her was enormous. She never worked in occupational medicine again. Her professional reputation was permanently damaged by the company's retaliation campaign, and her health suffered from the stress of years of litigation. But she expressed no regrets about her decision to expose the truth, stating in a 2001 interview that she would rather have sacrificed her career than remained complicit in ongoing crimes against innocent people. The courage displayed by Dr. Elizabeth Harper represents the moral clarity that was tragically absent from the corporate and scientific communities that enabled Stone's work for so many years. Her decision to risk everything to protect the victims of systematic poisoning stands in stark contrast to the callous indifference displayed by the institutions that profited from human suffering. The breakthrough that exposed the full scope of the Millfield conspiracy came not from a single dramatic discovery, but from the painstaking analysis of thousands of documents that Dr. Harper had secretly copied over 2 decades. When legal experts finally assembled these documents into a coherent narrative, the picture that emerged was more horrifying than even the most cynical observers had imagined. The evidence revealed that the Millfield facility was not an isolated case of rogue experimentation, but was part of a systematic corporate program to conduct human chemical testing at multiple locations across the United States. Internal corporate planning documents dating back to 1959 show that Consolidated Chemical had made a strategic decision to establish research facilities in economically dependent communities where population stability and regulatory oversight would minimize the risk of discovery. A corporate memo from December 1959 marked confidential, executive distribution only, outlined what company officials termed the Human Factors Research Initiative. The memo, signed by Consolidated Chemical's research director and approved by the board of directors, authorized the establishment of experimental facilities in at least 6 locations: Millfield, West Virginia; Riverside, Alabama; Pine Ridge, North Carolina; Desert Springs, Arizona; Valley Junction, Ohio; and Lakeside, Michigan. Each facility was designed to test different categories of chemical compounds on specific demographic populations. Millfield's assignment was chlorinated organic compounds and organophosphates, with research focused on generational transmission of chemical effects. The Alabama facility concentrated on pesticide compounds and their effects on reproductive health. The North Carolina plant studied heavy metal toxicity in older worker populations. The other facilities had similarly specialized research mandates that collectively covered virtually every class of industrial chemical produced by the company. The corporate documents reveal a level of coordination and planning that transformed isolated experiments into a comprehensive program of human testing that affected thousands of workers and their families across multiple states. Regular conferences were held where researchers from different facilities shared data and methodologies. Standardized protocols were developed to ensure that research results could be compared and compiled across different locations. Dr. Stone's role in this broader conspiracy was more significant than initially understood. Internal communications show that he served as the primary coordinator for the multi-facility research program, developing experimental protocols that were implemented at other locations and analyzing combined data from all participating facilities. His scientific reputation and academic credentials provided credibility for research that would have been questioned if conducted by corporate employees with less distinguished backgrounds. The scope of Stone's influence becomes clear from reviewing the scientific literature he produced during his tenure at Consolidated Chemical. Between 1962 and 1989, he authored or co-authored 127 scientific papers that were published in prestigious chemistry, toxicology, and occupational health journals. These papers established him as one of America's leading experts on human chemical tolerance and workplace safety, earning him numerous professional awards and academic recognition. What the scientific community never knew was that virtually all of Stone's research was based on data obtained through unauthorized human experimentation. The industrial exposure studies and occupational health surveys described in his papers were euphemistic references to systematic poisoning programs conducted without the knowledge or consent of the research subjects. The comprehensive data sets that made his research so valuable were compiled through decades of monitoring chemical poisoning victims. The revelation that much of America's understanding of industrial chemical safety was based on unethical human experimentation sent shockwaves through the scientific community. Journals that had published Stone's research faced difficult decisions about whether to retract papers that had influenced decades of safety standards and regulatory decisions. Professional organizations that had honored Stone's contributions struggled to address the ethical implications of research that had been built on systematic human rights violations. Even more disturbing was the discovery that Stone's research had been used to establish safe exposure levels for industrial chemicals that were still being used throughout American industry. Workplace safety standards that protected millions of workers were based on data obtained by deliberately poisoning the families of Millfield and other company towns. The ethical foundation of occupational health regulation had been corrupted by research that treated human beings as laboratory animals. The corporate documents also revealed the sophisticated legal and public relations strategies that Consolidated Chemical had developed to conceal its human experimentation programs. The company maintained teams of attorneys who specialized in suppressing evidence of chemical-related health problems and silencing potential whistleblowers. Public relations firms were hired to create scientific studies that would contradict independent research linking chemical exposures to health problems. A particularly damning series of internal memos details the company's response to early signs that their experiments were being detected. In 1973, an epidemiologist at the Centers for Disease Control had identified unusual patterns of birth defects in several communities where Consolidated Chemical operated facilities. Rather than cooperating with the investigation, the company launched a coordinated campaign to discredit the researcher and suppress his findings. The scope of the conspiracy also raised disturbing questions about how many similar programs might still be operating at other corporate facilities around the country. If Consolidated Chemical could successfully conceal human experimentation programs at 6 different locations for over 30 years, what other companies might be conducting similar research? How many communities might be unknowingly serving as testing grounds for industrial chemicals whose safety is being evaluated through systematic poisoning of local populations? These questions remain largely unanswered today, as the regulatory systems that failed to detect or prevent the Millfield conspiracy have not been fundamentally reformed. The techniques that Consolidated Chemical used to conceal their crimes, legal intimidation, medical system corruption, scientific publication manipulation, and victim silencing through settlements, remain available to other corporations that might choose to follow their example. The full scope of what happened at Millfield and other Consolidated Chemical facilities may never be completely known. Many of the victims have died, taking their experiences with them. Many others remain bound by non-disclosure agreements that prevent them from sharing their stories. Corporate documents that might reveal additional details remain sealed under legal protections that may never be lifted. The legal battle that had consumed 5 years and cost tens of millions of dollars finally reached its resolution in March 2000, but the settlement that emerged satisfied no one and left many crucial questions unanswered. After months of closed-door negotiations overseen by a federal mediator, Consolidated Chemical Corporation agreed to pay $285 million to resolve all claims related to the Millfield human experimentation program and similar operations at other facilities. While the settlement amount appeared substantial, it represented only a fraction of what the victims had, suffered, and would continue to suffer. The money was distributed among over 3,000 claimants, including original plant workers, their spouses, children, and grandchildren. After legal fees and administrative costs were deducted, individual victims received payments that averaged less than $75,000 per person, inadequate compensation for lifelong health problems, and genetic damage that would affect future generations. More troubling than the financial inadequacy of the settlement were the terms that Consolidated Chemical insisted upon as conditions for any payment. The company refused to admit any wrongdoing or acknowledge that their activities at Millfield and other facilities constituted human experimentation. The settlement agreement included comprehensive non-disclosure provisions that prevented victims from discussing their experiences or sharing information about the company's conduct with researchers, journalists, or other potential victims. The settlement also included a provision that sealed most of the evidence that had been gathered during litigation, preventing public access to corporate documents that detailed the scope of the human experimentation programs. While some information had already been disclosed during court proceedings, vast quantities of internal communications, research data, and corporate planning documents remained hidden from public view. Perhaps most controversially, the settlement included no provisions for ongoing medical monitoring or treatment of victims whose health problems would continue for the rest of their lives. Victims were expected to use their settlement payments to cover future medical expenses, despite the fact that many of them faced chronic conditions that would require specialized care for decades. Children and young adults who had inherited genetic damage faced the prospect of passing those defects to their own children, with no corporate responsibility for the ongoing consequences of the experiments they had never consented to participate in. The inadequacy of the settlement became apparent almost immediately after it was finalized. Many victims discovered that their settlement payments were insufficient to cover even their existing medical expenses, let alone future treatments. Families that had hoped the settlement would provide financial security found themselves facing the same economic hardships that had made them vulnerable to corporate exploitation in the first place. The environmental contamination left behind by decades of chemical production continued to affect property values and economic development opportunities. Businesses were reluctant to locate in an area with known toxic contamination, and families found it difficult to sell homes that might be contaminated with dangerous chemicals. The psychological impact of the Millfield case extended beyond the immediate victims to affect the broader public's trust in institutions that are supposed to protect public health and safety. The revelation that government regulators, medical professionals, and scientific researchers had failed to detect or prevent systematic human experimentation for decades undermined confidence in these institutions' ability to protect the public from corporate malfeasance. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of economically dependent communities to exploitation by powerful corporations. The pattern of targeting isolated communities with limited economic alternatives for potentially dangerous industrial activities was not unique to Consolidated Chemical, and similar dynamics continue to affect communities throughout the United States today. Environmental justice advocates used the Millfield case to highlight broader patterns of corporate behavior that disproportionately expose poor and working-class communities to environmental health risks. The systematic targeting of vulnerable populations for industrial experiments reflected broader inequalities in how environmental hazards are distributed and how corporate accountability is enforced. The international implications of the Millfield case were also significant. The revelation that American corporations had conducted systematic human experimentation, drew criticism from international human rights organizations, and raised questions about the adequacy of human rights protections in the United States. The case became a symbol of corporate impunity that damaged America's international reputation and credibility in human rights advocacy. Foreign governments and international organizations began questioning the reliability of American safety, research, and regulatory standards that might have been influenced by unethical human experimentation. This skepticism affected international trade relationships and cooperation on environmental and health protection issues. The legacy of the Millfield case continues to influence contemporary debates about corporate accountability, environmental justice, and human rights protections. The techniques that Consolidated Chemical used to conceal their crimes, legal intimidation, regulatory capture, scientific manipulation, and victim silencing, remain available to other corporations and continue to be employed in various forms today. Recent investigations into other industries have revealed similar patterns of corporate misconduct that suggest the problems exposed at Millfield were not isolated incidents, but reflect broader systemic failures in how corporate power is regulated and constrained. Cases involving pharmaceutical companies, tobacco manufacturers, and technology firms have demonstrated that the incentives and opportunities that enabled Stone's experiments continue to exist in other contexts. The victims of Stone's experiments who are still alive today continue to advocate for stronger protections against corporate human experimentation and better support for victims of such crimes. Their efforts have achieved some limited successes in strengthening legal protections and raising awareness of corporate accountability issues, but the fundamental power imbalances that enabled their victimization remain largely unchanged. The story of what happened at Millfield serves as a stark reminder of what can occur when corporate power operates without effective oversight or accountability. The systematic poisoning of 3 generations of families was not the result of a few rogue individuals, but was the predictable outcome of institutional arrangements that prioritized corporate profits over human welfare. The case demonstrates that preventing similar incidents in the future will require more than voluntary ethical guidelines or incremental regulatory reforms. It will require fundamental changes in how corporate power is structured and constrained, how victims of corporate crimes are protected and compensated, and how society balances economic interests against human rights and environmental protection. The children and grandchildren of Millfield's original victims continue to live with the consequences of experiments they never consented to participate in. Their ongoing suffering serves as a testament to the long-term consequences of corporate crimes and the inadequacy of legal systems that treat such crimes as civil rather than criminal matters. The true cost of what happened at Millfield, measured in lives lost, health destroyed, families broken, and communities devastated, can never be fully calculated or adequately compensated. The victims and their descendants will carry the scars of systematic poisoning for generations to come, while the institutions and individuals responsible for their suffering have largely escaped meaningful accountability. The Millfield case stands as one of the most extensive documented examples of corporate human experimentation in American history, but it is unlikely to be the last. Until society develops more effective mechanisms for controlling corporate power and protecting vulnerable populations from exploitation, the conditions that enabled Stone's experiments will continue to threaten other communities and other families who trust their employers and government institutions to keep them safe. The victims of Millfield trusted their employer, their government, their physicians, and their community leaders to protect them from harm. That trust was systematically betrayed by institutions that prioritized scientific knowledge and corporate profits over human welfare. The restoration of that trust will require more than financial settlements or regulatory reforms. It will require a fundamental recommitment to the principle that human beings can never be treated as experimental subjects without their informed consent, regardless of the potential benefits to science or society. The ghosts of Millfield continue to haunt American industry and regulatory policy, serving as a reminder of what can happen when power operates without accountability and when vulnerable populations are treated as expendable in the pursuit of knowledge and profit. Their story demands that we remain vigilant against similar abuses and that we never forget the human cost of systematic exploitation disguised as legitimate business activity.